I always wondered, if my father had been wealthier, would my mother have loved him? If he had earned more money, would my family have stayed together? Or would she have still found a reason to despise him, to trample on his dignity? My name is Isabella and this is my story. A story that, if you haven't lived through something similar, you might find hard to believe. That parents could treat their own child this way. As a child, I didn't really understand what was happening between my parents. I only knew that every day there were fights, mostly started by my mother. My father, David, worked as a technician at a manufacturing company. He didn't make a lot of money, but I remember that when he came home, he always smiled at me, pulled me into a hug, and asked about my day at school. I used to think that was enough, but to my mother, Angela, nothing was ever enough. She always looked at my father with disdain. "You call that making money? Wasting your whole day on some dead-end job?" I remember so clearly the day my father came home, his face filled with pride, telling my mother he had gotten a raise. He was so excited, thinking it would make her happy. But she just stared at him, lips curling into a mocking smirk. "That's it? I thought you finally got yourself a real job." I saw the smile fade from his face, as if someone had just drained the life out of him. Their marriage didn't last long. One day, my father packed his things and left, without a single word of complaint. I was too young to understand why he was gone. All I knew was that after he left, my mother became a completely different person. Or maybe she had always been that way and just no longer needed to hide it. She began playing the role of the struggling single mother in front of everyone. To the neighbors, co-workers, and relatives, she spun a story of an irresponsible man who abandoned his wife and child without a dime. "No one helps me," she would sigh dramatically. "I have to raise Isabella all on my own, working myself to the bone, barely getting a full night's sleep." Every time she said it, she looked exhausted, sometimes even teary-eyed. People believed her. They pitied her, and even as a child I could tell she enjoyed their sympathy. But the truth was, my father never abandoned me. He sent child support every month. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my life better. I knew this because I saw my mother take a check out of the mailbox every month. She would hold it up, stare at it for a moment, then laugh bitterly. "Look at this, Isabella. Your father actually thinks this is enough to raise you? What a pathetic man." Then she would either rip up the check or shove it into a drawer, pretending it never existed. I grew up surrounded by lies. I didn't dare protest, didn't dare ask about my father, because I knew that whenever I mentioned him my mother's rage would explode. And when she was angry, things only got worse for me. I never understood why she hated him so much. But one thing was clear. She didn't love me either. I was just a tool, a prop for her performance. And I realized early on that in my mother's world, only one thing mattered. For a long time I thought my mother treated me horribly because she was cruel to everyone. But then I realized, she wasn't cruel to everyone. Because when the right man came along, she became a completely different person. I was about 10 years old when my mother met James. He was nearly 15 years older than her, wealthy, powerful, and most importantly, convinced that my mother was a struggling, single mother doing her best to raise a child alone. It didn't take much effort for her to make him believe that. To James, my mother was gentle, fragile, a devoted mother who had been unfairly beaten down by life. They got married after just 6 months of dating. I remember the wedding, a lavish event with fresh flowers, an expensive gown, and distinguished guests. But what I remember most wasn't the extravagance. It was the way my mother looked at me when everything was over. The fake sweetness was gone. The warm smiles had vanished. Instead, there was only irritation, as if I were nothing but a thorn in her side. After we moved into James's mansion, I quickly learned my place in this new family. I wasn't my mother's daughter anymore. I was an extra. At first, she was just indifferent. She forgot to do my laundry, leaving me to wear the same wrinkled, oversized hand-me-downs that the housekeeper managed to find. While my mother and James enjoyed lavish dinners with steak and wine, I was sent to the kitchen with a simple reminder. There's bread and peanut butter. But that wasn't the worst part. My mother started interfering with my schoolwork in ways I never expected. Assignments I had spent hours working on mysteriously disappeared from my backpack. When I asked, she just shrugged. Maybe you should be more careful. My grades dropped. Teachers started calling home. For the first time, I felt a spark of hope. If my teachers knew something was wrong, maybe they could help me. But my mother only smiled sweetly at them over the phone. I'm really worried too. She's just been so distracted lately, always playing around instead of focusing. And just like that, the problem became my fault. But the worst was yet to come. One day, my mother announced that she was pregnant. James was overjoyed, and once again she fully embraced her role as the delicate, vulnerable woman in need of care. You need to be more responsible now, Isabella, she told me, one hand resting on her stomach, even though there was no sign of pregnancy yet. I need to rest. I'm counting on you. I didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. I had already stopped being her daughter, but now I wasn't even a child anymore. I was a maid, a ghost in my own home. And the scariest part? No one noticed. Except me. I don't know exactly when I started thinking about leaving. Maybe it was the night I stayed up scrubbing dishes while my mother lounged on the couch, complaining about her aching back. Maybe it was the morning I went to school hungry because my mother had, accidentally, forgotten to make me breakfast, while the table was still covered in leftover pancakes and eggs from her and James's meal. Or maybe it was when I realized that, no matter what I did, I would never be part of this family. One night, as I cleaned up the living room after dinner, James walked by and frowned at me. Isabella, you look thinner than before. He turned to my mother, who was scrolling through her phone, lounging against a pillow. Angela, are you sure she's eating properly? She didn't even look up, just shrugged and smirked. She's just going through puberty, probably losing her appetite. I stood there, gripping the dishcloth, heart pounding. James seemed mildly concerned, but he didn't press the issue. And life went on as usual. I knew then. If I didn't save myself, no one would. That night, when everyone was asleep, I snuck my phone out and called my father. I wasn't sure if he would answer. We hadn't spoken in years. But on the third ring, his voice came through. Isabella? I almost broke down at the sound of it. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it trembled anyway. Dad? I can't stay here anymore. There was a long pause. I held my breath, afraid he would say there was nothing he could do. But then his voice came through. Firm and steady. Pack your things, I'm coming. The next morning, my heart pounded as I carried my small suitcase down the stairs. My mother stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, eyes cold. Where do you think you're going, Isabella? I swallowed hard. I'm going to live with Dad. Instead of anger or surprise, she simply raised an eyebrow and slowly nodded, as if she had been expecting it. Then she smiled. A strange smile, empty of sadness or regret. Good. James and I could use the extra space for the baby. Her words stunned me. I had expected something, a little sadness, a little hesitation. But I realized, to her, I had never really belonged. I was just something to be discarded. As I stepped outside, my father's car was already waiting. He got out, his eyes filled with concern. Without a word, he opened his arms, and I ran into them. For the first time in years, I felt safe. I didn't look back. I knew my mother wouldn't be standing there watching me leave, because to her, I had never truly mattered. But to my father, I was everything. And that was all I needed. My life changed completely from the day my father took me away. I still remember the first moment I stepped into my father's apartment. A place that wasn't big or luxurious, but warm, and filled with care. Everything was neat and organized, with a room just for me. He didn't ask much about my past life with my mother. He simply said, "You don't have to look back anymore. We can start fresh now." And he kept that promise. My father worked harder than anyone I had ever known. He left his old job and started his own small tech company. I watched him build it from the ground up. Through the stressful days of financial struggles, the first contracts, and slowly, the company began to grow. When I was 14, we moved into a nicer home. When I was 16, he bought me my first car. Not a luxury vehicle, but an old sedan. Enough to give me the freedom to get around on my own. I no longer had to worry about food or dirty clothes. I was no longer invisible in my own home. I went to a good school, was encouraged to pursue my dreams, and for the first time, I felt genuine love from a family member. The years passed by like the wind. I threw myself into my studies, earned top grades, and participated in extracurricular activities. I didn't just want to succeed. I wanted to prove that I could do anything, that I was no longer the abandoned little girl my mother had left behind. When I graduated high school with honors, I received a scholarship to a prestigious university. My father cried at my graduation ceremony. He hugged me tightly and whispered, "I always knew you could do it." And I believed him. Because he was the first person who had ever truly believed in me. 4 years of college flew by. I graduated with honors, and on that day my father handed me a special gift, a small apartment in the city. "Consider it a reward for everything you've accomplished," he said, holding out the keys. I was speechless. I just hugged him, knowing that everything he did was always for me. I thought my life had finally become perfect. But then, the nightmare began. My father got sick. I found out when I received a call from the hospital. A cold, merciless diagnosis: terminal cancer. My world shattered in an instant. I couldn't imagine a life without my father in it. The following months, I quit my job and moved back in with him, dedicating all my time to his care. I sought every possible treatment, consulted the best doctors. But his condition worsened. One evening, as I helped him lie down in bed, he held my hand, his voice weak but steady. "Isabella? Promise me one thing." I nodded, my eyes burning. "Be happy, don't let the past hold you back, live the life you deserve." I wanted to tell him he would be okay, that I would find a way to save him. But I knew I couldn't lie. I just squeezed his hand and whispered, "I promise." 2 weeks later, he passed away. I was by his side until the very end, holding the hand that had protected me for so many years. I didn't cry on the day he died. I only felt empty. But I knew a storm was coming. And I had no idea that the woman who had abandoned me all those years ago, my mother, was about to return. 3 weeks after my father's funeral, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up. But a part of me, the part that was still drowning in grief and loneliness, pressed the button. "Isabella? It's your mother." The voice made me freeze. How many years had it been? 7, 8? Since the day I left her house, she had never called, never checked in on me. But now, with my father gone, she had suddenly appeared. "How are you, sweetheart?" I hesitated. Sweetheart? Since when was I her sweetheart? "I heard about your father." "I'm so sorry, Isabella. I know how close you two were. I just wanted to say that if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately, but another part, the little girl inside me who had once longed for her mother's love, hesitated. "Thanks," I said stiffly. She continued, her voice soft, as if nothing had ever happened between us. "I think it's time for us to reconnect. I miss you so much, Isabella. I was wrong to let you go like that." I didn't believe her. I couldn't, but in that moment I was too exhausted to argue. I just muttered, "Let's talk later, Mom," and hung up. But she didn't stop. In the days that followed, she called more often. At first, I ignored her. But as my apartment felt emptier and lonelier, I started answering. At first, her calls were simple. Asking about my job, my life, how I was coping with my father's death. She said the words I had once wished to hear from her. And I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had changed. But then, inevitably, the conversations shifted. James is struggling with work, the economy is so tough these days. Thomas is going to college soon and tuition is so expensive, I honestly don't know how we'll manage. I don't want you to think I'm calling because of money, I just needed someone to talk to, but could you help a little? Just so I don't have to worry so much. At first I said no. But my mother was never one to give up easily. I don't know why I gave in, maybe I was too tired to fight. Maybe a part of me still craved family. Maybe I just wanted to believe in her one last time. To see if she had truly changed. So I sent her money. Just a small amount at first. A little to help Thomas with his SAT prep. A little to fix her car. But it didn't stop there. She started calling more often. The small favors turned into bigger ones. And little by little, I found myself being pulled back into the cycle I had sworn never to return to. The call came on a Saturday afternoon, as I sat on my balcony sipping coffee, savoring a rare moment of peace after a long work week. "Isabella, I have something to talk to you about." My mother's voice was light, almost excited. I sighed. Lately, every time she said that, I knew it wouldn't be good. Our family hasn't had a real vacation in years. James works so hard, Thomas is about to start college, and as for me? Well, I've never had the chance to travel properly. She paused, as if waiting for my reaction. When I stayed silent, she continued, lowering her voice as if sharing a deep, personal secret. "I just found an amazing European tour package. It's a rare opportunity, a family experience that I truly believe will bring us closer together. And I was thinking, maybe you could help me out a little." I set my coffee down, an uneasy feeling rising in my chest. "Help you? You mean you want me to pay for this trip?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Oh, Isabella, don't say it like that. James and I aren't in the best financial situation. This isn't just about money, it's about family. We can finally make up for lost time." I closed my eyes, trying to suppress the disappointment swelling inside me. I had seen this coming for a while now, yet I had still been foolish enough to hope that my mother genuinely wanted to reconnect with me. Not just squeeze money out of me. "No, Mom," I said firmly. There was silence for a few seconds before she let out a laugh, her voice laced with feigned disappointment. "You are so selfish, Isabella. Do you have any idea how much I've sacrificed for you? I just wanted a small vacation and you can't even do that for me?" I gripped my phone tightly, forcing myself to stay calm. "You never sacrificed for me. You never have. All you've ever done is use me." I heard my mother inhale sharply. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted. Cold and venomous. "You're just like your father. Cold, ungrateful, only thinking about yourself." I let out a bitter chuckle. "If I'm like Dad, then good. Because at least he truly loved me." She sucked in a furious breath. "You'll regret this, Isabella. Don't think you can just turn your back on your family and still live a happy life." I didn't respond, I just hung up. The very next day, I received an offer to travel abroad for a month on a work assignment. I didn't even hesitate. I accepted immediately. I needed to get away, to clear my head. I had let my mother back into my life for far too long. And this time I swore I wouldn't make the same mistake again. After a month abroad, I returned home feeling lighter. Distance had given me the clarity I needed. I had made my decision. My mother would no longer have a place in my life. It was late at night when I arrived at my apartment complex. Dragging my suitcase up the steps, I felt exhausted, but relieved to be back in my familiar space. All I wanted was to collapse into my bed and finally enjoy the peace I had been missing for so long. But when I slid my key into the lock, it wouldn't turn. I frowned and tried again, still nothing. My heart began to pound. Could the building have changed the locks while I was away without notifying me? I stepped back and examined the door. No signs of forced entry. no damage. And then, the door opened. A woman in her mid-30s stood in the doorway, looking at me warily. Behind her, a man, presumably her husband, stepped forward. His expression puzzled. "Who are you?" the woman asked. I froze. Every nerve in my body tensed. "I'm the owner of this apartment. This is my home," I said, my voice dry. The woman and her husband exchanged glances. The man slowly shook his head. "No, this is our home. We bought it 3 weeks ago." My entire body went cold. It felt like someone had just punched me in the stomach. "What?" I whispered, unable to believe what I was hearing. "We purchased it from a woman named Angela. Angela Hudson." My heart plummeted. "My mother?" No. No, she wouldn't. She couldn't have. "There must be some mistake. I never sold this apartment," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor in it. The woman hesitated, then stepped inside and returned with a stack of documents. She held them out to me. "We have all the paperwork. Sale contracts, notarized signatures, everything is legal. If you need clarification, you should probably speak to your lawyer." My hands shook as I took the documents, flipping through the pages. And then I saw it. My signature. Or, rather, a forgery of my signature. My entire body went numb. My mother had forged my name to sell my apartment. I took a deep breath, trying to contain the fury boiling inside me. I couldn't stand there any longer. I mumbled an apology, turned on my heel and walked away from the building. There was no doubt about it. I had been betrayed, again. And this time she had gone too far. I stood in front of my mother's house, gripping my phone tightly, my breath coming in angry bursts. I had driven for half an hour without even remembering the roads I had taken, my mind consumed by one thought: the forged contract and the name Angela Hudson on it. My mother had sold my home. She had signed my name on the paperwork as if I didn't exist, as if I were nothing more than a resource to be exploited whenever she pleased. I pounded on the door with all my strength. Seconds later, it swung open. There she stood, draped in a silky cream robe, a wineglass in hand, looking as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Oh, Isabella, sweetheart. I wasn't expecting you to drop by unannounced," she said, tilting her head, her voice dripping with fake warmth. I stared at her, my heart pounding. I couldn't believe this woman had given birth to me. "What did you do?" I ground out, forcing myself to stay calm. She took a slow sip of wine and casually stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. But I didn't move. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Isabella. Why are you so worked up?" I yanked my phone out of my pocket, pulled up a picture of the sale contract, and thrust it in front of her. "My apartment. You forged my signature and sold it." My voice shook with rage. She glanced at the screen, then laughed. A soft, airy laugh that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, that." She shrugged. "You know, you have so much, Isabella. More than you need. You live in luxury, have a stable career, and yet, you're so stingy." I went rigid. "Stingy?" I repeated, barely believing what I was hearing. She took another sip of wine, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Family is about sharing, Isabella. I've sacrificed so much for you. Don't you think it's time you gave back?" Rage erupted inside me like wildfire. "Gave back?" I hissed. "You never treated me like your daughter. You never loved me. And now? You steal from me and try to justify it with this pathetic excuse." My mother set her wineglass down, crossed her arms, and her gaze sharpened. "So what are you going to do? Call the police? Let the whole world know you sued your own mother?" Her voice was laced with challenge. I looked at her, realizing for the first time that she had never believed I had the courage to stand against her. She thought I would endure it, just as I always had. That I would let her do whatever she wanted. But she was wrong. Slowly I pulled out my phone, holding it up in front of her, my eyes never leaving hers. "You're right," I said, my voice steady. "I'm calling the police." And for the first time, I saw my mother's smile disappear. The investigation moved faster than I had expected. As soon as I reported the case, the authorities got involved. Within weeks, all the forged documents, financial records, and my mother's fraudulent signatures were exposed. The truth was even uglier than I had imagined. My mother hadn't just sold my apartment. She was drowning in debt. Over the years, she had secretly borrowed money from various sources to maintain her lavish lifestyle. Extravagant parties, designer clothes, luxury vacations. To cover it up, she had forged financial documents, even faking James's signature to access more money. James was in shock when he learned the truth. I will never forget the look on his face as the lawyer laid out all the evidence. He sat frozen, his face pale, as if the world around him was crumbling. "What have you done, Angela?" James muttered, his voice strained. My mother, instead of the fear I had expected, simply crossed her arms, her expression cold. "I did what was necessary to protect my family," she said, as if defrauding and forging her own daughter's signature was some noble act. James shot to his feet, looking at her as if he were seeing a stranger. "Family? You've been lying to me for years. You don't care about anyone but yourself." Then he turned to the lawyer, his voice firm. "I want a divorce, immediately, and I will be taking full custody of Thomas. I will not let him stay with this woman for another day." My mother went pale. She opened her mouth to argue, but for the first time in her life no one believed her anymore. My mother's case went to trial just a few months later. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Fraudulent signatures, forged bank records, countless high-interest loans, and testimonies from other victims she had scammed over the years. On the day of her sentencing, I was in the courtroom. "Defendant Angela Hudson, your actions were not just a case of financial fraud but a deep betrayal of those closest to you. The court hereby sentences you to 3 years in prison and orders full restitution of all misappropriated funds, including the proceeds from the sale of Isabella Hudson's apartment." The judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom. I didn't know what I expected to feel. Satisfaction? Anger? Relief? But when my mother was handcuffed and led away, she turned back to look at me, her eyes cold and filled with hatred. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You're nothing but an ungrateful child. Don't think you can just walk away from me." I held her gaze for a long moment, then slowly replied, "We don't need to walk away, you destroyed yourself." And this time, I knew for certain, she would never find her way back into my life again. I stood in the living room of my new home, afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows, reflecting off the polished hardwood floors. This wasn't a small apartment in the city anymore. This was a real home. With a lush green backyard, and enough space for me to finally breathe. After recovering the money from my mother's trial, I decided to buy a new house in the suburbs, far away from the memories of my past. I wanted a fresh start, a place where I could move forward without the weight of old wounds dragging me down. My job at the company my father built continued to thrive. I had spent the past year learning, rebuilding what he had created, and now, I was ready to continue his legacy. Every time I stepped into his old office, I could feel him there, watching, supporting me. James kept his word. He divorced my mother immediately after the trial, and won full custody of Thomas. I didn't know if the two of them still spoke, but I knew one thing for sure. Thomas was free from my mother's manipulation, and that was all that mattered. Thomas reached out to me after everything was over. "Isabella, I don't know what to say. I'm sorry for everything Mom did to you." I remember the long silence before I finally responded. "You don't have to apologize, you were a victim too, Thomas." I didn't hate him. He wasn't to blame. He was just a child caught in a family where lies and manipulation were the norm. Even so, I wasn't in a rush to rebuild our relationship. I needed time. Maybe one day we would become part of each other's lives again. But today was not that day. And my mother? I didn't know, and I didn't care. She had been removed from my life in a way that was irreversible. The letters from prison, The desperate phone calls. I ignored them all. I had given her too many chances, and I would never make that mistake again. Today, I stand at the threshold of a new life. No more manipulation. No more lies, exploitation, or helplessness. Just me, my life, and a future that I would build with my own hands. And for the first time ever, I feel truly free. Isabella's story is not just about escaping manipulation and betrayal. It's a lesson in self-worth and independence. In reality, many people find themselves trapped in toxic relationships where love is weaponized for personal gain. But like Isabella, we always have a choice. The choice to stand up, break free, and reclaim our lives. Because sometimes, family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by those who truly love and respect us.